Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are so glad you are joining us today. If you are listening to this, you are probably the kind of person who loves to look closely at the text of Scripture. You are the kind of person who wants to know not just what a verse says in your English translation, but the actual mechanical workings of the original language behind the text. So, today we have a specific mission. We are taking a comprehensive look at a stack of linguistic sources. Specifically, we have lexical entries, theological dictionaries, and scholarly commentary notes, and they are all focused on a single fascinating Hebrew word. That word is T. We have pulled extensive definitions from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English Lexicon, and we have brought in commentary excerpts from scholars like Samuel Rolls Driver, Thomas Kruger, and George Angus Fulton Knight. Our goal for this deep dive is to track how this single word, EP, moves from describing raw emotion and joy all the way to defining everyday business and practical schedules. Okay, let's unpack this. We want to understand how this specific noun shapes our view of human desire, and more significantly, how it illuminates our understanding of God's sovereign will.
Looking at these original languages is never a dry academic exercise. It is quite the opposite, actually. When we examine a word like OP, we are gaining a direct window into the theology that shapes our entire understanding of God. For those of us who hold to a Reformed perspective, specifically adhering to the Westminster Confession of Faith, we talk quite a bit about the decrees of God. We talk about how God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. But sometimes, when we discuss the decrees of God, we can accidentally make it sound like a cold, mechanical, administrative process. By looking at this specific Hebrew word, we're going to see firsthand what the confession means when it talks about God's good pleasure. Understanding this word proves that God's decrees are not reluctant, obligated choices. They are actions of supreme delight.
Yeah, I have this stack of lexical entries right here in front of me, and I want to start right at the beginning of the definitions they provide. The primary definition of pupi across our sources, whether you are looking at the standard dictionaries or the theological word books, is joy, delight, or pleasure. But the dictionary notes make a huge deal about the grammar here. They point out that this noun is frequently paired with specific prepositions. You do not just have pupi floating in a vacuum. You take pleasure in something, or you have delight in someone. I am looking at these grammatical notes and I see the Hebrew prepositions listed, but why does the grammar matter so much here? Why do the lexicons spend so much ink on the prepositions?
The grammar matters because it reveals the psychology behind the word. The dictionary notes show OP used with the Hebrew preposition li, which means to or for, and the preposition be, which means in. What this grammatical structure requires is an object for the delight. You cannot just experience a generic ambient sense of happiness. You are directing your joy toward a specific target. This orientation of the heart is critical. The emotion does not exist independently. It is a response to an object, a person, or an action that has captured your affections.
Right, and I want to bring up a specific historical event that our sources highlight to show this orientation of the heart. 1 Samuel 15.22. This is the very famous confrontation between the prophet Samuel and King Saul. The context here is heavy. Saul was commanded to completely destroy the Amalekites, but he compromised. He kept the best of the sheep and the oxen, and when Samuel confronts him, Saul justifies his disobedience by claiming he kept the animals to sacrifice them to the Lord. And then Samuel delivers this devastating question. He asks, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord?" The word translated delight there is ipapa. Can you weigh in on how this specific word dismantles Saul's entire justification?
If we view this historical moment through a Reformed theological lens, this single verse establishes the entire basis of true religion. Saul thought he was doing religion correctly. He thought the mechanics of the sacrifice, the blood, the altar, the outward action was the point. He believed he could manufacture favor through a ritual. But Samuel uses the word depi to show that God's pleasure, his joy, is not triggered by empty external rituals. His delight is in genuine obedience. The object of God's joy is a heart that listens to his voice. This completely destroys the idea that we can earn standing before God through mechanical actions. True religion is about knowing where God's delight rests and aligning your life with that delight. God looked at Saul's massive, elaborate sacrifice and found absolutely zero OP in it.
Wow, yes. And we see this same principle applied to the human heart in another major reference from our sources, which is Psalm 1.2. The text describes the righteous man, and it says his delight is in the law of the Lord. Again, the word is the P. Now, in our modern context, the word law usually brings up feelings of restriction, speed limits, or tax codes. It is rarely something we associate with delight. How does this fit into our theological framework?
This connects directly to the affections, which is a massive category in our theology. The unregenerate mind hates the law of God. To the natural man, the law is a crushing burden, a set of rules that restricts his autonomy. But for the righteous man, the man who has received grace, the law becomes an object of supreme satisfaction. This is complete reversal of the natural human condition. He takes a P in the law. The law is a reflection of God's perfect, holy character, and therefore meditating on it produces actual, palpable joy.
I think an analogy helps picture this. Think about the difference between a child eating a plate of steamed vegetables and a child eating a bowl of ice cream. A parent can command a child to eat a plate of broccoli. The child might comply. They might chew it up and swallow it, but they're doing it out of pure obligation, maybe out of fear of losing dessert or fear of punishment. There is outward obedience, but there is zero VP. Now, put a bowl of ice cream in front of that same child. You do not have to command them to eat it. You do not have to threaten them with a timeout. They consume it because they take genuine delight in it. Their affections are fully engaged with the object. What Psalm 1.2 is saying is that the righteous man consumes the law of God like ice cream, not like forced vegetables. There is genuine, eager delight.
I like the direction of your analogy, but the Hebrew pushes it even further. It is not just that the child enjoys the taste of the ice cream. The child's entire disposition toward the parent providing the ice cream changes because of it. It is an eager, joyful reception that affects the whole person. In fact, one of the sources notes a phrase from Proverbs 31.13 describing the excellent wife working with her eager hands. The literal Hebrew translation provided in the lexicon is working with the dopey of her hands. Her hands are working with joy, with pleasure. It is not drudgery. The joy of her heart literally animates the labor of her hands.
That is such a vivid picture. The dictionary entries also give us some fascinating negative examples of this word, which help clarify the meaning even further by showing us the inverse. When we see where delight is absent, we understand the concept better. The sources list Ecclesiastes 5.3, which states that God has no pleasure in fools. The text literally says there is no upi in fools, but the prophets use this negative construction in a very visual way. The sources list Jeremiah 22.28 and Hosea 8.8. Both of these verses use an incredibly vivid phrase. They describe a vessel wherein is no pleasure, a vessel with no bupi. Can you unpack this imagery of the broken vessel for us?
Think about the role of a clay pot in the ancient Near East. Pottery was everywhere. It was the plastic of the ancient world. If a vessel is beautiful or if it holds water perfectly without leaking, the owner takes pleasure in it. They keep it, they use it, they might even display it. But a vessel wherein is no pleasure is something broken, defective, or contaminated. It cannot hold water. It cannot store grain. It is useless. Therefore, it is discarded into the rubbish heap. When Jeremiah and Hosea describe people or entirely rebel nations as a vessel with no op, they are describing something that has lost its value to the owner. It is cast aside because it brings no joy and fulfills no purpose.
So we have to ask you, the listener, what does this all mean for you? When you look at these examples, from King Saul's rejected sacrifice to the discarded clay pots of the prophets, you start to see that delight is not just a fleeting feeling. In the biblical text, opia is a measurement of value. What you take pleasure in reveals what you value. Right. And conversely, if you find no opia in something, you treat it as worthless, like a broken vessel.
Which logically requires us to move to the next phase of the word. Because opian measures value and joy, it naturally transitions into a word about longing.
If delight is what assigns value, it makes perfect sense that what we value dictates what we long for. And that leads us seamlessly to the second major definition in our lexical sources. The word progresses from meaning joy to meaning wish, desire, or longing. The usage shifts from experiencing pleasure to wanting something that will bring pleasure in the future.
The psychology of the Hebrew mind presented here is strikingly accurate to human nature. You only desire what you first perceive as delightful. Desire is the engine, but it is driven by the fuel of delight. You do not long for things you find repulsive. You long for what you believe will bring you opia.
The sources highlight 2 Samuel 23.5 to show this transition. This is from a section often called David's last words. We actually have a commentary in our stack from Samuel Roldstreiber specifically on this section of 2 Samuel. In this verse, David is an old man looking back on his life, reflecting on God's covenant with him, and he asks a rhetorical question. He says, "Will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire?" The word for desire there is tapi, all my desire.
Driver's note places this firmly in the context of David's final reflections. David is looking at the covenant, the specific promise of salvation, and the royal line that God established with him. And David identifies that covenant as the sum total of his desire. His longing is completely wrapped up in what God has promised. He does not say his desires for more land or more wealth or more military victories. His topi is the covenant of God.
Another massive example of this definition is Job 31.22. Job is defending his integrity against the accusations of his friends, and he says, "If I have withheld the poor from their desire." Again, the word is hopi.
This verse is highly significant because it grounds basic, visceral human needs in this specific word. The plea of the poor, their desperate, aching need for food, for shelter, for justice, is described as their thopi. It is what they long for to bring relief and joy to their immense suffering. Job is stating that he never stood in the way of the poor finding that relief. He did not block their path to finding provision and safety.
Let's pose a thought experiment for you as you listen to this. Think about your own desires. Think about the things you long for on a daily basis, the things you daydream about when your mind wanders. Our desires dictate our actions. In our theological framework, we understand that fallen humanity has corrupt desires. Our natural EP is oriented toward rebellion and self-service. We desire things that are actually broken vessels. This is why the concept of grace is so central to our theology. But it is a specific kind of grace. Can you unpack the concepts of total depravity and effectual calling for us in a way that connects directly to this idea of changing our P?
This is a crucial point of application. When we use the term total depravity in Reformed theology, we are not saying human beings are as evil as they could possibly be. We are saying that sin has affected every part of us, including our affections. Our wanter is broken. Left to ourselves, we will never naturally desire the things of God. We will never find a P in His law. So when we talk about effectual calling, we mean that God does not just offer an invitation and hope we accept it. He actively intervenes and changes the core of what our hearts actually want. He replaces the broken affections with new affections. Grace is God regenerating us so that our P aligns with His. We cannot simply choose to desire the right things through willpower. The orientation of our delight must be resurrected by God.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We move from the desires of regular people, or the desperate desires of the poor, to the desires of kings. The scale of the word expands massively.
The lexical sources list quite a few verses showing Apia used specifically as the desire of monarchs.
We have a string of references from 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Let me lay out the historical context. We have 1 Kings 5, verses 22 through 24. King Solomon is building the temple, a massive architectural undertaking. He sends a message to Hiram, the king of Tyre, asking for cedar and cypress timber. The text says that Hiram provided all the decree, all the desire of Solomon regarding the timber. Then we have 1 Kings 10.13, which is identical to 2 Chronicles 9.12. The queen of Sheba travels to Jerusalem, sees the wealth and wisdom of Solomon, and before she leaves, King Solomon grants the queen all her desire which she asked, all her devotee.
When you look at these royal contexts, you realize how much weight this word can carry when paired with authority. A sovereign's desire is not just a passing wish or a daydream. When a king has a thopia, it is a command waiting to happen. If King Solomon desires timber, fleets of ships are mobilized, thousands of workers are dispatched into the mountains of Lebanon, forests are cut down, and the entire economy of a neighboring nation shifts to accommodate it. The desire of a monarch comes with the absolute authority and the resources to ensure that the desire is fulfilled in the physical world.
A sovereign's desire is a command waiting to happen. It does not just sit there as an internal feeling, it executes reality. It alters the landscape. And that bridges us perfectly into the third major definition provided by the lexicons, which is easily the most theologically massive section of our sources today.
The lexicons define P here as the good pleasure, will, purpose of Yahweh.
We have moved from human joy to human desire to royal commands, and now we arrive at the absolute sovereign will of God Himself. I want to read the specific references from the prophet Isaiah that the sources provide. Isaiah 46:10, where God declares, "My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." The word translated purpose is adi, and Isaiah 44.28, where God speaks of the Persian king Cyrus long before Cyrus was even born, saying, "He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, all my brapi."
We need to dissect this thoroughly using our Reformed perspective. The Westminster Confession states that God, from all eternity, did, by the most wise and holy counsel of His own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. When the Confession uses phrases like the counsel of His own will or His good pleasure, we are looking at the theological concepts built directly upon this Hebrew word, ate. The framers of the Confession understood that God's sovereignty is intimately tied to His delight.
So when God says, "I will accomplish all my purpose," He is quite literally saying, "I will accomplish all my delight." Spot on. God's will is his happy. His decrees are not burdensome obligations that he must fulfill to keep the universe running. They are the expressions of his supreme joy. Whatever God ordains, he ordains because it brings him pleasure to do so. He delights in his own sovereign plans. There is no separation between what God decrees and what God enjoys.
We have another verse from Isaiah in our notes that brings this into sharp, almost shocking focus. I want to slow down here because the weight of this verse requires us to pause and truly consider what is being said. The lexicon cites Isaiah 53:10. This is the famous chapter about the suffering servant, predicting the crucifixion of Christ centuries before it happened. The text says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief." The word translated will or pleasure there is avepe. The dictionary entry actually provides a slightly varied literal reading, translating the second half of the verse as, "The babe of the Lord will prosper in his hand." This connects directly to the mechanics of the atonement. It pleased the Lord to crush him. Think about the gravity of that statement. The supreme plan of redemption, involving the agonizing physical and spiritual suffering of the Son of God on the cross, was God's tipi. It was his delight and his purpose. Now we must be careful here. This does not mean God takes malicious or capricious joy in suffering. It means that the outcome, the vindication of his perfect holiness, the satisfaction of his justice, and the salvation of his elect people was his supreme delight. The atonement prospering in the hands of the Messiah was the fulfillment of the Father's deepest, most resolute joy.
Let me use an analogy here to try and grasp this. Think about a master architect designing a magnificent, sprawling cathedral. The blueprints he draws are highly technical. They involve precise measurements, stress loads, material specifications, and engineering mathematics. To an untrained eye, those blueprints just look like cold, calculated geometry. But to the architect, those blueprints represent his highest artistic vision. They are the realization of his highest creative joy. When the cathedral is finally built according to those exact specifications, the architect looks at the stones and the glass, and he feels immense pleasure because his design has become a physical reality.
I like the architect analogy, but let's take it a step further to align it perfectly with our theology. An earthly architect might be constrained by the laws of physics, or by his budget, or by the skill of his construction workers. He might have to compromise his vision, but God has no constraints. God's decrees are the uncompromised blueprints of his joy. When we read that God does all his purpose, all his OP, we are reading about the master architect ensuring that his glorious design is perfectly realized in history without a single alteration or failure. It is not just divine mathematics. It is unstoppable delight.
I want to look at a note from the sources regarding how this concept was translated later on in history. The sources indicate that the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, produced a couple of centuries before Christ, translates this massive concept of deop using the Greek word thelema.
Thelema is the standard Greek word for will. It is used extensively throughout the New Testament.
And we use that English word will all the time in our theological discussions. We talk constantly about the will of God.
We do, but the English word will can often sound very administrative, almost clinical. It sounds like a legal document, a last will and testament, or a sheer exercise of raw, unfeeling force. But knowing that the Greek thelema in these Old Testament passages is translating the Hebrew thupi changes our reading entirely. The Hebrew root retains that warmth. It retains the concept of delight. So when you pray the Lord's Prayer and you say, "Thy will be done," you're actually praying, "Let your supreme delight be accomplished on earth as it is in heaven."
That reframes so much of how we view God's sovereignty. It is the sovereignty of joy. Now, the sources show us a fourth major category of meaning for 2P, and it moves us into the realm of value and aesthetics. The word is used as an adjective for precious things, specifically jewels and stones.
This is a beautiful linguistic extension of the concept. The sources cite Isaiah 54:1, which speaks of delightful stones. The literal Hebrew is stones of tupia. They also cite Proverbs 3:1 and 8:11, where wisdom is compared to precious things or jewels. The text says that all things to be desired, all P, cannot compare to wisdom.
I look at this and I have to ask, why does a word for joy and sovereign will suddenly apply to shiny rocks?
We can connect this right back to the core theme we established at the very beginning of our analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Why is a stone precious? A diamond or a ruby is essentially just a piece of compressed carbon or mineral sitting in the dirt. It has no intrinsic utilitarian value. You cannot eat a diamond to survive. You cannot build a sturdy house out of rubies. The value is not inherent in the rock itself. The value is assigned entirely by the delight of the beholder. A stone becomes a precious stone because a human being looks at it, takes stock in its beauty, and decides it's worth a fortune.
The delight creates the value.
Yes. And this has massive theological implications when applied to God's relationship with his people.
One of the sources introduces Malachi 3.2, where God promises that Israel will be a land of OP, translated as a delightsome land or a land in which one takes joy. But even more striking is the derivative noun mentioned in the dictionary text, hepzibah.
Hepzibah is a beautifully poetic name given to the city of Zion, representing God's people. It translates literally to, "My delight is in her." This is how God views his redeemed people. In our Reformed theology, we talk about the doctrine of unconditional election. This doctrine teaches that we are not chosen because we possess inherent value or inherent righteousness, or because God looked down the corridors of time and saw that we would choose him. In our natural state, we are like common, worthless stones. But God, in his sovereign grace, sets his delight upon us. He declares, "My delight is in her." By doing so, he makes his people into precious stones. They are the objects of his specific electing delight. He assigns the value by bestowing his dobe.
So when you consider this, you have to ask yourself, what do you treat as precious stones in your own life? What are the objects, the pursuits, the relationships, or the goals that you assign high value to because you take OP in them? And how does your list of precious things align with what God calls precious? God calls his law precious. He calls his redeemed people precious. He calls wisdom precious. We need to align our evaluation system with his.
The continuous alignment of our affections with the affections of God is essentially the ongoing work of sanctification.
If delight is what assigns value to a precious stone, it makes perfect sense that what we value dictates where we spend our time and money, which actually explains this unusual shift I saw in the later biblical texts as I was reading through the sources. This brings us to the fifth and final major section of our analysis. The sources document a semantic shift in late biblical Hebrew, specifically in books like Ecclesiastes, also known as Koheleth, and the later chapters of Isaiah. Okay comes to mean matter, affair, pursuit, or business.
The shift from joy to daily business sounds jarring at first glance, but it is a thoroughly logical progression of human behavior.
Let me list the verses the dictionaries provide for this late usage. Ecclesiastes 3.1, a very famous verse. It says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." The word translated matter there is dupi. The sources also list Ecclesiastes 3.17, a time for every matter, and Ecclesiastes 8.6. We actually have a specific commentary note from Thomas Kruger on this verse from his volume on Koheleth.
Kruger's note falls under his section on knowledge and authority in his commentary outline. What is highly revealing here is how the Greek translators handled this late usage of the word. Earlier, we noted that the Septuagint translated the P of God as thelema, or will. But Kruger and the lexical notes point out that in Ecclesiastes, the Septuagint translates upi as pragma.
Pragma, that sounds like our English word pragmatic.
It is the exact root. Pragma means a deed, an action, a practical matter, or a business affair. So the ancient Greek translators recognized that by the time Ecclesiastes was written, apia had shifted in its common usage. It was no longer just referring to internal joy or future desire. It was referring to the external, practical actions that fill up a human schedule.
We see the same usage in Isaiah chapter 58. The sources cite verses 3 and 13. We have a commentary excerpt from George Angus Fulton Knight on this section. In Isaiah 58, God is indicting the nation of Israel for their intense hypocrisy. They are fasting, going through their religious motions, but God says in verse 3, "Behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure." And in verse 13, he warns them against doing your pleasure on my holy day. The word in both places is AP. The dictionary entry notes that it can be translated as doing your business or affairs.
Knight's commentary helps us see the conflict clearly. Israel is complaining that God is not answering their prayers during their fasts. God replies that their fasts are useless because, while they are supposedly denying themselves food to seek him, they are aggressively pursuing their own upia, their own business affairs, and exploiting their workers. They are physically fasting, but their schedule is still entirely driven by their commercial ambitions. What's fascinating here is tracing this entire linguistic evolution. How does a word that starts out meaning pure joy become a word for running errands or conducting business transactions? If we connect this to the bigger picture, it makes perfect sense. It reveals a striking reality about human nature. We are fundamentally worshiping creatures. Whatever we delight in, whatever our core foo is, in the end, dictates our daily business. You cannot separate your affections from your schedule. If you delight in money, your daily pragma, your practical business, will be consumed with acquiring wealth. If you delight in comfort, your daily affairs will be structured around avoiding difficulty.
The calendar never lies.
Precisely. Our calendars and our bank accounts are the truest reflections of our affections. The shift in this Hebrew word demonstrates that what starts in the heart as joy inevitably moves out into the hands as business. You spend your time on what you take pleasure in.
Let's do a recap of the massive linguistic and theological arc we have analyzed today. We took a stack of dictionary entries and scholarly commentary notes on the Hebrew word hopi. We watched it start as pure joy and delight, defining the orientation of the heart either toward true obedience or toward foolishness. We saw it crystallize into desire and longing, motivating the desperate actions of the poor and commanding the vast resources of kings. We saw it manifest perfectly in God's sovereign will, proving that his eternal decrees are the realization of his absolute good pleasure. We looked at how it assigns value to precious things, like stones and the redeemed people of God. And finally, we tracked its evolution in late biblical Hebrew, where it dictates our practical, daily affairs and business.
It is a remarkable progression. It covers everything from the highest, unchangeable decrees of the Almighty down to the mundane tasks we write on our to-do lists.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. If the ancient Hebrew mind sees absolutely no separation between what gives you joy and what occupies your daily schedule, I want you to look closely at your mundane routines tomorrow morning. When you wake up, look at your calendar. Look at the tasks you have prioritized. What delight is quietly dictating your business? Are your affairs driven by a desire for status or comfort or control? And how does viewing your daily schedule through the lens of God's sovereign, joyful purpose change the way you approach your day? When you recognize that God ordains all things according to his sopi, his good pleasure, you can engage your daily business with a heart seeking to align with his joy.
We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking. We wish you clarity as you process these concepts, and we hope you find great delight in the text of Scripture.